Good afternoon. Hi. I was just sound checking, sorry. Good afternoon. Okay. One of the scariest things I did recently is I went to a seminar in London, and the first thing the guy said is, this is going to require audience participation. And of course, when the Brits, we're not like you Americans, right? You're all like, yay! And we're like, what? Anyway. So thank you for coming this afternoon. This is definitely the graveyard shift, isn't it, after lunch? But I'm sure some more people will trickle in. My name's Chris Atkinson. I'm a solutions architect with MarkLogic, and I specialize in the financial services sector. This session is really about hoping that you can take advantage of a situation that doesn't actually happen very often in any industry, although it does happen more frequently than we would probably like within the financial services industry. And my question is, what do all of these three things have in common? Well, that's true. So, he's absolutely right. So what they all have in common is that they made me rather large amounts of money because, at least for the first two, I was a contractor in London, milking the vast amounts of money that were thrown at IT departments to fix these two big problems, right? And the reason why money was thrown at them is because whether they were real or not, and the Eurozone conversion was definitely a real event, and fixing, the Y2K date problems on all of the mainframe systems was a very real event. The reality is that the IT departments that I was working on were not viewing these as particularly problems. They were opportunities to use that budget to make a strategic change to what they were already doing, and they would never get these opportunities to do it in the near-term future again. What we're seeing on the MarkLogic side is the financial crisis of 2007 has freed up budget because effectively you have to adhere to these regulations in most of the jurisdictions that exist around the world. And that means a lot of money has to be thrown at the problem. And most of the customers that I speak to, they have two questions. How can you help me satisfy my regulatory requirements? And how the hell can I actually get more out of that solution as well? And the reason why they ask that question is because fundamentally, what the regulator wants is what the business wants. The regulator wants deeper insight, more actionable information flowing around their organization, which, let's face it, is pretty much what all of our businesses want. The challenges, of course, particularly with large financial services institutions, is these are a big issue, right? There are multiple different functions. They operate in maximum isolation from each other. The data models are alien. They're difficult to achieve. But what the regulators are forcing is, yeah, you've got to do this, but not only that, but you've got to do it before a certain date arrives as well. And the people that are running the banks, the people that are running the IT, they're scared because if they fail, the worst case is that the bank can go bust, the institution can go bust. And I'm working at the moment in finalizing two implementations in Amsterdam that if we don't succeed in solving their data problems and delivering the solution, they will not be in business this time next year. It's that simple. And that's, I'm kind of like, I like a good challenge, right? And that's a great challenge to have. A little bit scary, but it's a great challenge to have, but it's also great to have that credibility. So I kind of broken this session into three pieces. What is the immediate challenge? So the first problem, right, is we want to solve the regulatory challenge. And then we've got to think about, while we're doing this, how can I make this deliver what the business needs as well, not just a bunch of regulatory reports. So I took a little bit of time to map out the different regulations, the different bodies, and this isn't it, because that would be a much, much bigger piece of paper. But if you actually boil down really what the most important things are right now, I mentioned MiFID II within Europe, but the thing that's really, really coming up on the horizon fast is FRTB, which is the Fundamental Review of the Trading Book. What that basically means is that the previous implementation of risk management for financial institutions, which was BCBS 239, which is formulated by the Basel Commission, is being upgraded. Okay? What FRTB does is it takes it to the next level. Previously, the BCBS 239 legislation was all about you being able to calculate your risk. And that risk was typically calculated as value at risk, VAR. Now, VAR is actually relatively straightforward to calculate. VAR is realistically, what are the positions? How much money have I got in the marketplace? And then you calculate that, and you calculate the risk against it, and the regulator then levies a charge against you. Now, the charge isn't something you pay the regulator. The charge is a rather large amount of money that you need to have in easily liquidatable assets and a plan to liquidate those assets if your organization comes under stress. Now, the reason why this is bad news for a bank is that easily liquidated assets don't make them a lot of money. So cash doesn't actually generate a huge amount of cash. What they want to do is they want to put cash into derivatives, into investments in order to maximize their returns and their revenues. So the more money that they have in these charges, the less profit they make. Okay? The big shift between FRTB and BCBS 239 is that the tightening of the regulation is forcing some rather unpleasant realities onto the businesses. And fundamentally, it's no longer about just what is your value at risk. Now it's actually what's your value at risk, how are you calculating your value at risk, where is the information coming from, and a much deeper level of how that risk is calculated. Now this is all wrapped up into something called the market risk capital charge. And it effectively comes into two columns, okay, or two standards. The internal model approach and the standard approach. Now, there is a significant cost differential for you as a bank in terms of which one of these you fall into. Now, historically, under BCBS 239, you applied for this, because this is the one you want to be in, right? This is the one that requires you to have less capital. You applied for that at a bank level, and you were assessed at a bank level. And if you managed to meet the requirements of it, showing that your internal processes were good enough, then at a bank-wide level, you were good to go. That's changed. Now, you have to apply for it both at a bank-wide level, but actually at a desk level as well. So every single operating function that's within the scope of the reg now has to be applied for independently, and it can be revoked. So even if you manage to succeed in being placed under the internal model approach, you still have to calculate that because it could be revoked at any time. So it's literally a double standard. You must do both, but you want to base your risk calculations and your capital charges on this approach. It also has some new facets that are pretty nasty. So over here in the US, you have CCAR, right, which is part of the Fed's regulation for testing your models. Under Basel, they're implementing a very similar thing, but this isn't just the testing of the model. You have to test the model and attribute the model to your profit and loss account. So you not only have to say that your model works, but you actually have to prove it against your P&L. It's pretty rigorous. So now we're not just looking at trading behavior, asset classes, and how they're manipulated, and how they're reported, and how information is aggregated across those activities. We're now looking as well at how the hell we integrate that into the rest of the business, a big problem. Now, as if that wasn't enough, they've also implemented this. So this is the exposed shortfall charge. Typically, the old method under the internal model approach was to calculate the last 10 days of risk on the tail of your deal. So after the deal is complete, what is the exposed risk, which normally tails away over time, and to take an average of that. The new exposed shortfall risk is calculated differently. It's calculated in two different ways. First of all, it can go up to 120 days. So depending on the asset class that you're looking at, that calculation, the tail, can be calculated over 120 days. That's a big difference. And it's also variable. So that's a scalable variation depending on what the asset is that you're trading. The other issue is that if you actually look at that shortfall charge, it's taking the calculation as no longer being the average, but the peak. It's the maximum exposure of that shortfall, not the average. Okay? And that, obviously, and you're smiling at the back, you understand the implication of that. So this is bad, but if you think that's bad, the implications of falling into the standard approach, which now has this involved, is way worse. How much worse, I'll show you in a second. I had to double check the figures because I couldn't quite believe how bad it was. But there is also this. This is now something even more kind of rigorous, which is the regulator will provide you with a map of risk factors that you need to map your activities to and then calculate your risk charges against that, and that's brand new. So what's the impact? That's the impact, okay? You definitely do not want to be on that side. So the mean of the calculations that a study that I read had was 47% increase in capital charges if you're on the standard approach, up to an average of 80% capital charges. But the good news is, if you want the good news, is if you can actually satisfy all of the internal model approach demands, then actually that could reduce your capital charge. We've got to be really honest here, right? We're not talking about a small implication here. We are talking about potentially billions of dollars for some institutions in terms of how they have to reallocate their capital charges within their institutions. So this is big. This is really, really big. And it's big from a banking point of view, but it's really big from a data point of view as well. So, you know, I actually I put down 8 points here because I ran out of more bullet points, to be honest. The summary of all of these bullet points is that not only are you going to be holding data for longer, you're going to be calculating risks across a wider and deeper set of data, but you also need to tie together the history and the provenance of that information so you can guarantee the flow and the supply chain of that information. So these are big, big difficulties. However, the good news is we can help. That's the really important message here. So the first thing is, you know, let's take Deloitte's view on this, right? If you're a relational guy and you're building all these models in relational systems right now, or you've just spent a lot of money building out a Hadoop cluster to do your last set of regulations, Deloitte view this as the sticking plaster, which is you can keep doing what you've been doing for the last 10 to 15 years, but you're running out of runway. There is only so much you can do before you have to make a step change. Also, you have to understand why they're saying that. And what they're basically saying is really this, which is the relational systems that we've used of the past and the technologies we've used of the past are not agile enough to manage our future requirements. The way that we transform and load data across our institutions, the way that we republish information multiple times, means that it's almost impossible for us to gain what we would call a congruent view of the data at a point in time. And by congruent, what I mean is that if you were to take a snapshot of the data and the calculations being acted on it anywhere in the organization at a point in time, you will get the same answer, okay? That's really difficult to do if you're publishing information across different silos or into data warehouses from people who are acting upon data independently. And it hampers the business's agility when you start to tie all this together. It's a simple question. How can I basically take advantage of what is a massive regulatory issue and also do something that's really good for my business, right? I'm a great believer, and I'm sure most of the people in this room are successful in what you do. It's probably why you've been sent here by your business, or you've been sent here because they don't like you. I'm going to put you in the first category, right? And the chances are everybody in this room has learned that, generally speaking, we've all got more projects to do than we actually have time. So the ones that win are the ones where we can see that actually doing this project actually helps me, you know, do 2 or 3 other things at the same time. We all look for the quick wins where we can deliver more than just a single item. So the first step is to aggregate the data. And there's 2 different methods of doing this in basically my opinion. Storing the logic outside of the system, so effectively using the database as a store and forward database. In this example, and this is actually an example from one of our customers in London, Deutsche, they basically tag the information, they pre-process the information that's coming from the sources. They don't normalize it, they don't harmonize it. It gets loaded into MarkLogic, but we flag the data first to identify its eligibility for certain types of reporting classification. It's then aggregated within MarkLogic, and an asynchronous process external to MarkLogic picks that data up, calculates it, runs the risk calculations, decorates the data back in to the environment associated with the original data, and then you can actually report out to the various solutions. And that report goes out to surveillance processes, to the SaaS grid, to risk, compliance. It goes out to multiple consumers. But the great thing is they all get to see the same data. And very, very importantly, we're not changing the original data. We've maintained it. What we've done, this is a new concept that we need to introduce to this, is we've started to look at this from a metadata point of view. This here is metadata. We've added new facts to the original data without changing it. Now, no aggregation conversation can be complete without discussing harmonization. And the harmonization process is also important. That is a step and a process as you aggregate the data to try and normalize, if you like, the information that is within the system. Basically, it is doing what is shown here, which is taking attributes that may be different but have the same semantic meaning across all of our sources. I may have an attribute which is, let's take a, I don't know, let's just say has credit, right, as a value within the bank. That value has credit, could be 1 on one system, the digit 1, it could be yes, true, enabled, valid across others. We can calculate and we can harmonize these things at query time, but it's much better for us to do these up front at the ingest time and use rules in order to do this. MarkLogic does this very well via business thesauruses and dictionaries. So we solve that problem for you. So assuming we've solved that kind of problem, which we have, and we think it's all about the aggregation, what about if we want to actually do the logic inside the platform? So a different architecture. Bear in mind I'm an architect, right? So I've always got to have some kind of PowerPoint slide of it in architecture somewhere, is this, which is we actually start to pull the information into the database and we process the business rules within the database. It's a different method of achieving the same outcome. Now this kind of architecture, I believe, lends itself much better to smaller institutions. If you're processing millions of trades a day, then you're probably going to use the former architecture with some embellishment. If you're not, and you're doing some lesser-based reporting requirements across lesser data sets, then you can do this. The advantage of this architecture is you actually have a very distinct set of templates that you plug your data in through this process. This is all about effectively rendering the data, using the thesaurus, and then creating this view at runtime. The difference of this architecture is that, as well, is that much of this is created at the point of query rather than kind of mapping this stuff up front. Just a different way of cutting the same thing. So we've aggregated the data, we've harmonized the data, or we've found ways of harmonizing the data at query time, 2 different architectures to achieve that. That will allow us to satisfy our regulatory demands right now, flat, okay? Deutsche, we delivered their implementation in 5 months. Currently working in insurer in the Netherlands. We've started a project 2 weeks ago, and we will deliver it in January. Well, actually, we're going to deliver it in December, or they go bust. And we'll deliver it, and we're on schedule. But that's just that thing, right? That's just the Y2K project that we just delivered. That's the Eurozone project. We haven't achieved a wider business outcome yet. So this is where we start to get super clever. We need to operationalize the data. Now, I used that term, and by the way, I replaced it 5 times before I actually went back to operationalize, because I know that operationalizing data was like a big buzzword like 3 years ago, right? Industrification or industrialization of IT. It was all very similar. But I couldn't think of a better word, to be honest. So if anybody can come up with a better word, that would be great. What we're actually doing is this, okay? We want to make a data lake. We want to create an information fabric. We want to create something that allows us to publish the same data with ease across our organization. Now, the difference between a data lake and a data swamp is a data swamp is where data goes to die. Okay? You fill it up, it consumes vast amounts of resources, but it ultimately has no real valid meaning. And Forbes highlight this really, really well with these statements. You need to tag your data with metadata so that you can derive the right meaning for the right consumers. And the consumers may be the regulator, it may be your internal people. And if you're going to do that, then it's probably a good idea to identify what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve with the metadata. And they come down to these 4 pieces. First of all, just increase, everybody wants more information. So increase the information that's available to all of your business functions. But make sure, of course, that it has the right meaning and relevance for those functions. Otherwise, you've just generated noise. Okay? Assuming you get that right, you've now got a problem to solve, which is you need to make sure that you deliver that in a timely fashion. FRTB is daily reporting, weekly reporting, and monthly reporting. That's probably not going to be good enough for a lot of your business functions, because I can tell you now, from every time I've implemented a regulatory solution, the second question that comes up halfway through is, oh, the MIS guys now want some real-time reports out of this. Can you do that for us? Yeah? So we're already prepared for that, which is always fortunate. So you think about the time it takes to deliver more information in real time, and really importantly, you need to ensure that you're guaranteeing the quality of the information and that you can prove the quality of that information. The metadata is the key, right? And it's not difficult to do. So within MarkLogic, we have the capability to not only aggregate the information directly, but what we can also do is we can plug ourselves into the metadata enrichment process, tag that metadata with the original model, and then we layer a search capability over the top of that. Now that is powerful, right? If you want to go and do this in a different architecture, you have to plug all of these different components together yourself. This is held within the same system. What that means is that you can deliver faster, and you don't need to worry about how I'm going to do this. You now actually just need to worry about what I'm doing. What kind of regs am I delivering? Where is the data that I need to aggregate? I'll let the system handle the mechanisms of actually doing it. Now, if you're having a conversation about metadata, you've got to mention this and this. Who here has got projects that are running AI or language processing at the moment? Is there anybody here? Okay. The thing about this kind of architecture is it lends itself really, really well to exactly that type of opportunity. The great thing is depending on what you're doing with your language processing, your either and your artificial intelligence, you're ultimately automating the creation of the metadata itself. Or you can even be automating the joining of the different attributes within your environment. That's a much more complex and more challenging thing to do. But certainly, using AI, machine learning, language processing to generate the metadata and attaching that to your original information is a brilliant way of enriching the system, which then allows you to start to tie that information together in a more visible and harmonized way. What it means as well is that by tagging this and automating this information and putting the information, those tags back with the original data, you don't lose the richness of the original data. You don't lose the lineage of the original data. You are adding new facts or new information to an existing system. It's improving in terms of its quality and its usability. So now you've got, I often use like the child's mobile analogy, right? Which is, do you call them a child's mobile? That thing that you put over a kid's bed and the toys hang off it, right? That's how I look at a data model, right? But the way I look at more adaptable data models is imagine that I've got a child's model and I've got all those different toys, but I've got them wired into two different, ceiling braces, if that's the right word. And that's actually how our data works. People look at the same data in different ways. The reason why you have all of those different silos in the organization is because they all look at information in different ways. And they all have different data models because those data models fit their functional purposes better by having a different model. So if we're going to aggregate data together and we're going to try and create an information fabric that stretches across the whole organization, there is no way on God's green earth that you will ever create a data model that fits everybody's needs. True? It is physically impossible. Okay? So how do we fix it? We have to think about separating the presentation layer away from the data layer. And this is how we do it. So we think about it in two ways. We think about the lineage and the provenance of the information, and then the functional lenses that we can apply to that data. Now the functional lens, that's not difficult to do if you have the right technology. So the functional lens is a semantic map of how a different function views that information. And you've got to think about how departments' view of their data evolves over time. In a relational world, you will go through various schema alterations, right, over the life of the data. And that's the reason why is because the view and the needs of the function change over time. So it's really quite simple. What you need to do is you need to think about, well, how can I create a lens that I can evolve over time that allows me to explore my data, that allows me to have functionally independent views of my data without actually restricting any of the other usages. How can everybody look at the data how they want without impacting anybody else? And there's two ways of doing that. There's a very advanced way, and there's a less advanced way. And the very advanced way, I only say that's very advanced because a lot of people are not using this technology yet because it has really yet to find a full use. But that's change, or not use full use, its use case was not fully understood. But that's changing rapidly. So if I look here on the left-hand side, most of you might have heard of has anybody here not heard of the envelope pattern after the last 2 days? Okay, that's good to hear. Paying it. Has anybody, actually, test, who has heard of the envelope pattern? Okay, some people didn't put their hands up, so there's a delta there. Okay. The envelope pattern allows us to put metadata inside the original document itself. Okay? And if you're doing that, that's a great way to create functional views that you can map into a single view. You might have heard of the row index over the last couple of days. Brilliant technology. It effectively creates a flattened view of your data. It's a query. It's a view. And that works brilliantly. You can stitch that together from various different documents, from different data models that are held within the same database. Perfect. But this is where it starts to get really exciting. Because using an ontology, you can create a map of facts. How do these facts relate to each other? And it's the fact that different departments consider different facts to relate to each other differently that is really powerful here. This could be, this is absolutely an example of a trade, right? A customer has a contract has an order, the trade is associated with the order. But that could equally be a HR record. We could actually have in here a customer has a contract, that contract has a number of traders associated with the portfolio, so on and so forth. So we can have lots of different values and different views of data. The brilliant thing about this is that I can create multiple lenses or ontologies for my business, and I can map them independently to the data that maps to the original data here. So these are the RDF triples within the MarkLogic database, and these are the original documents with the envelope. I've got two different ways of satisfying the same requirements. This, though, is incredibly powerful. This is where people are heading. And it is all about being able to create those metadata lenses. Now, the final word, assuming now we've got aggregation sorted, we've pretty much decided how we can generate the metadata, and we're starting to stitch the metadata together in such a way that it has meaning to our different functional uses. And by the way, that ontology is also, there's an industry ontologies like FIBO that we map to, which allows us to report very quickly and easily to the regulators and evolve quickly. That's the important thing. We also have to think about that provenance and that data lineage. And the great thing here is that somebody else has done all the hard work for both MarkLogic and for you. That is using the Prov ontology, so the provenance ontology, often referred to as Provo. So Provo, as much as it has, these are the commonly used components of Provo, but effectively what it does is it tracks how information arrives in the system, how it's acted upon, and the various stages of enrichment that it traverses through. You can start off with, it basically boils down to three pieces, which is who is the agent, what is the actual entity that you're involved with, and what is the activity you perform upon it. And then you can use, this is actually a subset, there's a whole bunch of additional stuff in here, but these are the most commonly used ones that define how it traversed your system. That being said, that basically means that you've pretty much nailed down everything you need to do from a data perspective to actually go for the internal model approach rather than having to force yourself or be forced down the standard approach. This is a really, really capable way of achieving all of those requirements. It just requires that step change, but very importantly, it creates something that can form the cornerstone of a much larger implementation of data across the organization and much wider usages. I can tell you, hands down right now, that out of the two big opportunities I worked on in the last year, not one of those has not been distracted by the fact that other consumers within those organizations have said halfway through the project, we want some of that as well, right? Distractions are good like that. I can deal with distractions like that. It's a good problem to have, right? But that's the proof in the pudding. When people say, I like that and we want some more of that, you know you're onto a good thing. So I'm going to summarize in a second, but I'd like to open the floor up to any questions that you might have. Yes. Both. So the question was, just for the videos, so somebody was going to run around with, where's my microphone ring? Question is regarding the semantic ontologies, is that something MarkLogic does, or is that something that requires third-party tools? So the answer is we store the metadata, the triples within MarkLogic, but we recommend that you use an ontology manager in order to publish those ontologies into MarkLogic and then map them to the metadata that you create within MarkLogic. So yeah, we don't create the tooling to do that. There are much better companies that do that and have interfaces that are designed for MarkLogic. And one of them is outside SmartLogic. So yeah.
You mentioned the two paradigms earlier, external conversion at the edges and internal, kind of converting the sources. Is there a view on ideally getting, because obviously there's time to market advantages to doing the conversion on the edges that gets you up and running quicker, right? And you can address complexity in a much more time-sensitive fashion. But the internal approach might be the right long-term solution. So is there some kind of a migration path that you have that's a hybrid to kind of get you from conversion at the edges to the internalized model?
I challenge actually whether one is more preferable to the other. I would say that the store and forward system has some significant advantages in terms of it dumbs down the database layer. Okay, so there's less logic in there, which means the database layer can perform faster. You're putting less load onto it. But you do lose a lot of the richness of the database layer by doing that. The second architecture is more like the one I showed, is actually more of the extreme end of that. My real belief is that you got somewhere in the middle. Right. Exactly, yeah. But you're absolutely right, and it depends on the, interestingly, I wouldn't even say that one is faster to deliver than the other. They're just two different approaches. So, Deutsche delivered their store and forward mechanism. They did that in 5 months. ABN are still implementing theirs. Now, theirs is a much bigger project because the data models were not fully understood and the data sources were not fully understood. So most of the work is actually sat there, not on the actual building side. It's actually on the understanding side. Theirs will take longer to deliver and is a more involved project. But they're also doing, they don't have those external systems to do that mapping, so that's why we put them in as part of the project as a whole. It actually allowed us to develop the tooling for them and develop the rules engines for them with relative ease. Otherwise, they would have had to get those mechanisms from somewhere else and then integrate them in. So architecturally, it became easier to put those inside the database because we knew how to do it, and we had a clear path for them.
Is there, there's no typical answer, but is there a preference that you're seeing that large, complex financial institutions are taking? One approach versus the other? Which one's more prevalent?
Ask me in a year. At the minute, it's kind of 50-50. At the minute, honestly, it's a sliding scale. Yeah, I honestly wish I could say that one, but it's difficult to say. They have different, and it also comes down to what their long-term goals were. Certainly, the second use case was also driven very, very heavily by they wanted to reuse the logic. So, MiFID II has 64 fields. Right? And then 16 fields for real-time reporting. So we call those, there's an entity that's created. But they found value in those entities, and they wanted to publish those entities. So what they wanted to do is have other consumers consuming the trade store, nothing to do with regulation, that could just draw down on those entities, slot them into their reports, and then run their information and management reports and APIs off them. So that was actually a big reason for doing it there. It was actually the reuse of those entities across the organization that was the major driver for that architecture. Good question. Thank you. Hi.
Thanks. Is there anything in doing this that requires that you already have upgraded to version 9?
No. There are advantages to upgrading to MarkLogic 9,
sure.
Certainly. And Jim from Product Management, I have to be very careful, he's sat here, and if I say anything wrong, he'll come down on me. He's bigger than me as well. But MarkLogic 9 is brand new. It has not been around for, what is it, more than 2 or 3 weeks? All the projects I'm working on, or the projects I was working on until last week, were all based on MarkLogic 8. However, one of the really nice things is that the existing technology, which is extremely mature, is still in MarkLogic 9. So that means that you can start to use that technology and experiment with it. without risk of any of the newer technology, which may have, it's a version 0 product,
Yeah.
it may have some gotchas, they tend to, won't impact you. And I actually have a customer who's using MarkLogic 9 already in the test environment for delivering their MiFID II project in December. But they won't be using any of the MarkLogic 9 capabilities, but their long-term roadmap already has MarkLogic 9 capabilities in it. But they'll come after December. And of course, the reason that they're thinking is, well, look, we're using all the stuff that we already know works really, really well in MarkLogic and MarkLogic 8. By the time we actually get to the deadline in December and we've wrapped this project up, MarkLogic 9 will be super mature. It'll be on its version 1 or version 1 and version 2 of it, which means we can just take advantage of it, and we've already done the learning inside the lab. So that's their approach. Quite a pragmatic approach, and I kind of like it. Hi. Yeah. Oh, sorry, you're at the back. Yeah.
Sure. Is there any plans in the future to like expose some of this metadata as probably as a REST service or some queryable repository so other tools can pick it up?
Well, there's no, you can do that now anyway.
Okay.
So there's no reason. So MarkLogic has a REST interface. There is no reason why you can't republish that metadata out of the MarkLogic environment. But my question would be is, why would you do it?
Assuming that the enterprise already has governance tools around lineage from other sources that are not MarkLogic,
Yeah.
or not using MarkLogic, we're probably going to want to centralize that knowledge.
Yeah. So you can do that, certainly. So you're thinking of your governance tools being another consumer, basically.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
You would effectively just be querying the data directly. We would recommend that you don't create entire copies of it, because that might actually start to get you out into this hub and spoke model where you can't guarantee the congruence of the data across the estate. But basically, yeah, it's very easy to extract. It's just a query to extract the metadata. Absolutely.
Just had a question about the metadata automation. Are
Yeah.
there any, you mentioned artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So do you have any customers that have, how do I say this? Do you have partners that you bring to the table that you've seen successful, or is it up to the end user customer to sort of define that?
So I'll be really honest. I have my first customer right now who is kicking the tires on it, and I'm not a computer science major, so I struggle to understand the hell out of it. It's not my domain. I build the architecture and they slot it in. But yeah, it looks like well, they believe it's a perfect fit, and I'm going with them on that. But I don't know. I couldn't tell you basically what they're actually using at the back end. We've also had customers in the past, actually, with KPMG in the UK. We had surveillance processes that were using. Was it AI, or was it an extremely advanced algorithm for surveillance? Probably the latter. But yeah, similar thing.
So are you plug and play with pretty much all the vendors, or are you really exploratory at this point? So.
It depends on what their interfaces are that they've built for. The richness of MarkLogic is that you can, so generally an interface for a relational database, which is, let's be honest, right? The majority of data lives on relational databases, unstructured systems. AI is great for unstructured, right? And we're really good at serving up unstructured data, right? The original MarkLogic's concept was really around publishing data. So we work extremely well with that. REST interface is brilliant, very, very simple to architect, very, very simple to plug in. If, however, the AI is expecting ODBC, historically that's been a bigger challenge with MarkLogic because, if you want to extract billions of rows out of tables, then that's actually where relational is really good, right? It was optimized for that. But recently with MarkLogic 9 and the Optic API, we can now actually deliver, we won't be able to deliver at that kind of performance, right? Although actually that's across a scalable cluster, we can do very, very well, really, really well. But it just depends on what the interfaces they're looking for. We can satisfy it, and we can make sure that the data model works really efficiently for it. And we have customers, certainly I've got one in New York, who bought MarkLogic because it kicked the ass out of their Exadata in terms of ingest load performance, right? So we can ingest and we can report really, really well. But we just have to be, it's a long convoluted answer. But basically, yes, we can work with them. Out of the box, it just needs us to build an API and an interface. But since that's already designed into MarkLogic, that's relatively easy to do.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
That was good.
Any further questions? Okay, so just wrapping up then, the key points of this session really were to demonstrate the fact that we do have immediate regulatory demands, and you can use MarkLogic to satisfy those and satisfy them more easily than what you would be able to do otherwise. But the key concept is actually not just to achieve those, but also to operationalize your data and very much develop an iterative and agile process to publishing that information to all of your consumers with your operational data. So thank you very much. Thank you.